Yeah, I mean him on the weekend as well. Jonathan will be okay. Yeah. We'll wait for a couple of minutes. I think we'll start. There may be some latecomers, but I think we'll start. I'm Earl Drake. I'm the acting director of the David Land Center. Welcome to the Pacific Region Forum, which is being presented by Simon Fraser University in collaboration with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And I will just take a couple of minutes to explain what's going to happen. There will be our guest speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be devoted to questions, so sort of 5 minutes before 3:30, I'll ask Jan Walls to thank the speaker. There will be a little time to meet him afterwards, but we can't linger forever in this room, but there'll be a little time for sort of one-on-one after the 3:30 period. Without, well, may I just, there are a number of distinguished visitors here, and I don't want to recognize you all by name, but there's one man who must be recognized especially, and he is sitting over here. He is the Dean of Japan Watchers and the role model for all of us who believe in public service. He's been a volunteer for so many different public service ventures. He was chairman of the Asia Pacific Foundation, and currently he is chairman of the Asia Pacific Trade Council. Mr. Arthur Hara is doing this work for the province of BC. He's brought people together to do a series of market advisory group studies. First one on China is here, and the second one probably the second one on Japan is being done by John Powell under the direction of Arthur Hara. So welcome, Arthur.
And I'm a harsh critic.
That's right. And now, without further ado, I would like to call on Professor Paul Evans of the Pacific Foundation of Canada to introduce our guest speaker. I think he could be more objective about him than I can.
Thank you, Earl, and thank you all for being with us today. It's an important time in the evolution of Japan between prime ministers. The prime minister comes in, and it's an important time in Canada, as we are also in the midst of a political transition with a new government in place that is trying to think its way into a different and perhaps dramatically different relationship with Asia. And in that context, Japan being probably more important on Ottawa's screen than it has been in recent years. It's a pleasure to get to introduce not the Drake that most of you know here in Vancouver and at Simon Fraser University, but the next generation, Mr. Drake, David Drake, who is our speaker today. I had not had an opportunity to meet him before today, but had heard a great deal about him from students that have worked for him. Some of my students have really enjoyed that, from his colleagues, and from the Asians who meet him, whether it's in Japan or in earlier life in Indonesia and some other parts of Asia. David Drake is the Minister Counselor in the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, where he served for about the last 3 years. His career are there any students here? How many are students here? Are any of you going to become diplomats? How many of you would like to be diplomats? Well, here's the recipe for success. First of all, make sure you're in a variety of different interesting postings, and not just in the Department of Foreign Affairs, but in a career that has included working for CETA, the Canadian International Development Agency, being a key player on Canadian forest products and their connections and negotiations with forest issues. Someone who can then negotiate or be part of the Kyoto climate change set of issues as a negotiator, someone with a diplomatic posting in Indonesia, and someone who can bring together the diplomatic and the functional areas that are so important to Canada. And if that's the recipe, here is the individual with a career that has made that happen. Mr. Drake will speak on an extraordinary subject. Is this your title, David? Building a Beautiful Japan? Is that one of Mr. Koizumi's phrases? Abe's phrases. Please welcome David Drake, someone who is caught between Japan and Canada at a very interesting moment.
Thank you very much for that generous congratulation. It's my particular pleasure to be here today. Minasama, konnichiwa. It's a great pleasure to be amongst you today here in Vancouver at a time where Japan is becoming so prominent in the world headlines, and also here in Canada, and at this critical time in the Japanese political history, where we move from a maverick to an entirely new type of prime minister in Japan. My talk today is really to impart to you what I think and what my colleagues in the embassy think is happening in Japan at this point in time, and to share that with you, and most of all to get your sense of this as we move towards the questions and answers. So I have quite a few slides. If I'm going on too much, my colleagues will trip me up or something, and we'll move towards the question and answers as soon as we can. But let me just get underway. I've called this Building a Beautiful Japan, Junichiro Koizumi's legacy and the challenges for facing Shinzo Abe. Building a Beautiful Japan is Mr. Abe's slogan at this point in time, and I'll come back to that in a moment because there's more to it than that. It's a time of hope and reawakening for Japan, continuing reawakening, and I symbolize that in a beautiful screen painted by a friend of mine, Hiroshi Sugimoto. And it's the spring and the plum blossoms, and the beginning of new hope and new ideas. So let me just get underway and talk to you a bit about, if the computer will, there we go, if the computer will cooperate, what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, on the 20th of September, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan elected Shinzo Abe as its leader. Now, on the 26th of September, Mr. Abe will become the next and 90th Prime Minister of Japan. Now, what I'm going to talk about, first of all, is some reflections on Koizumi's legacy, Prime Minister Koizumi's legacy, a bit about who Shinzo Abe is, because I know that there's a lot of talk and surprisingly a lot written in the media these days, which is very, very good to see, and what the challenges facing him are. To some extent, what the implications are for Canada, although I think that's something which we're going to have to learn as he becomes more, as he starts enunciating more what he intends to do, and then finally some concluding thoughts about the whole thing. So let me get underway. Junichiro Koizumi, an enigmatic and man and somebody who has begun a process of transformation of Japan. Many images on here, not all of them. I couldn't fit them all on the screen, but on the screen you can see the political maverick, as he puts the one eye in the Daruma before he starts the election. The person who has tried to put Japan more on the world stage. So there he is at the United Nations. Definitely a person who has brought Japan to an unparalleled level of alliance with the United States. The man who has doggedly gone to the Yasukuni Shrine. The man who led Japan, his party, to an unprecedented electoral victory. The sort of the media star and sometimes often an unpredictable person. There he is throwing the first ball at the Yankees. The man who sought to move Japan past its current stasis with North Korea to different effects. The man who triumphed in terms of putting the postal reform, and the man who was constantly looking towards as he is in that picture. Let me talk a bit first about the politics of the henjin. Henjin, Japanese phrase which is used by Japanese, not something that I invented by any means, but it means strange or unusual person. And it is true that Mr. Koizumi has brought a completely unusual approach to Japanese politics. He has, for the first time, brought a mass appeal, despite the sense of this person is very, very different than what we're used to. It's a politician who lacked internal party support, relied on public support and personal charisma more than any other prime minister in Japan. There are just many, many stories about that, and I'm sure you've heard many of them. He has tended to take bold action in policy areas that he believed in, that would consolidate his support, and he correctly gauged the importance of reform to voters. And the best example of that was last year's election in the lower house, where he completely stumped not only his own party, but the opposition parties as well, who got it completely wrong and went down to ignominious defeat. He, if necessary, went over the heads of his own party to appeal for his desire for change, and he pursued very unorthodox tactics, which gave him a strategic advantage in his 5 years as prime minister. Let's look a bit at Koizumi's domestic political legacy. First of all, he's had a huge impact on the Japanese political scene. He is the second longest-serving prime minister since the war. 5 years. He set about to destroy, and those are his terms, the LDP and Japan's post-war system. This is the destroy verb is perhaps a little difficult for us, we in Canada, to understand, but what he meant was the dismantling of the iron triangle by which government and the bureaucracy, the political class, and and industry worked together to bring Japan from the ashes of the Second World War, and to have an almost statist approach to pull Japan up by its bootstraps. Worked very well for some time, but eventually became very outmoded, and it created a kind of over familiarity of the process, which eventually bred corruption and was not at all in Japanese. So much of that, of course, is still in place in Japan, and he has only partially succeeded in dismantling this. But it is certainly my view that the seeds of the process of dismantling that have definitely been sown, and any successor needs to be, or potential successor needs to show that they are continuing in the same vein. He called a snap election in 2005 to pass postal reform bill and proved that the public demands reform. There's a lot of discussion in Japan about whether or not, and elsewhere in the world, whether or not Japan will continue the movement towards reform. I'm of the view that it does, and largely because the public will not stand for a reversal. And I'll go back into that as we continue. He leaves office with a huge majority. It's as I say, unprecedented in Japanese history, and one which was done at the expense of many different established cliques and so forth. I mean, some long-standing LDP politicians were swept to the side and created their own parties in some case. A very different type of politics in Japan, which is set about. It may be difficult for Shinzo Abe to maintain the majority in the upper house elections in 2007. I'll come back to that because that's key. Let's look a bit at Koizumi's economic legacy. I know that there are many who think that the economic legacy that Koizumi leads is not all that significant. Certainly, my colleagues and I at the embassy are not of that view. It depends a bit what you're comparing with, of course, but certainly what I would argue is that if you look at what you had before, there has been tremendous movement. Not all of it's due to Koizumi, but a good deal of it is due to either to his administration and what key people have done and the bills which have been put through, putting these policies into law. He has reformed Japan's once debt-ridden banking system. It's really almost completely changed now. There are some that still need to recover in the hinterland, but even that is reforming quickly. Slashing public works. Even during the time of the collapse of the bubble, of the so-called last decade, Japan tried to pull itself up by its bootstraps by investing in public works and making a bad situation even better. This has been slashed, and it is a small, although it continues, it is much less than it was. Privatizing Japan Post. Absolutely went to the edge of his abilities to be able to privatize Japan Post, and while that is far from perfect, it is the beginning of a longer process there. Cutting off government invested interest from the easy stash of money, and this is absolutely crucial. Once again, we come back to that iron triangle. The money which is available, floating around within the Japanese system, helped the politicians get elected. They in turn served industrial interests and of course supported by the bureaucracy. That easy stash of money is gone. It's gone. Attempts to recreate it are more than often run into exposure by the media and others, and by government auditors and so forth. The triple excesses of the bubble year are now largely gone. Corporate debt, capacity, and labor are now largely gone. There has been real economic growth of 2.6% in 2005. Just to give you a sense of what that represents, that's about the same as adding, or actually a bit more than adding the economy of Malaysia to the global economy in that year. Faster growth in the Eurozone, faster per capita growth than Canada. Consumption has been growing steadily, investments growing rapidly. Labor productivity is the highest in the OECD, although they're coming from a little far back. And more or less the end of deflation. We'll get into that endless dialogue, but the CPI is mildly positive, and there's been a turnaround in land prices and bank lending, which suggests that reflation has begun, particularly in the big cities. Let's look at Koizumi's foreign policy legacy, which I call trans-Pacific strength and regional tensions. First of all, the Japan-US alliance. It is now at an unprecedented level. Through much of the 70s and 80s in particular, Japan kept its distance to the extent that it could from the United States. Now there is an unabashed alliance with the United States, which is fully in place. The basis has been put in place for that, and even much of the irritants are being dealt with in terms of this enormous deal which has been put together between the United States and Japan in terms of dealing with the Okinawa problems and moving a large number of the American troops both around Japan and to Guam, all paid for by Japan. So this is very significant. Japan can look at the rest of the world because it has, the reason that Japan can start thinking about how it reassesses the world is because it stands on a firm and unprecedentedly, and an alliance which is unprecedented in its strength. That leads me to the next issue, of course, the issue of the Yasukuni Shrine. Everyone who knows about Japan, it seems to capture most of the headlines, was Koizumi's uncompromising stance in going to the Yasukuni Shrine, in what he describes as going to pay homage to those who died, and to ensure that this never happens again. And those are his words. And of course, the problems with the neighbors that will require a new prime minister to resolve. Japan is seeking a greater role on the world stage. You'll be aware that Japan has been seeking, as a part of a group of 4 countries, to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Japan deployed to Iraq. Admittedly, these were not a report about our troops in Iraq. And if I can say what this really meant for Japan was deploy to Iraq, but in deploying to Iraq, it forced Japanese to look at themselves in terms of where Japan stands in the world. What are we doing in Iraq? It's not a daily question. It wasn't a daily kind of question before in terms of where are we in the world. It forced Japanese to start looking at each other, and this is part of a wider phenomenon that is happening in Japan now. Much more activists in Asia. To a certain extent, there's a lot of catch-up with China, which is moving quickly through and cementing trade ties and other kinds of political ties. But it's more than just that. There's also Japan wanting to play its role, and Japan played a very important role in dealing with the immediate aftermath of the Banda Aceh tsunami. A little bit less in Sri Lanka, but in Banda Aceh in a very, very major way. Unfulfilled challenges. Well, no question that Koizumi did not succeed across the board. And there's much more to be done. First of all, he did not succeed in fully eliminating the vested interests. I think there's no question about that. And you just have to live in Japan to every night there seems to be some other scandal coming from some other place, highways or airports or whatever, where it appears that the old system seems to be alive and kicking. Modernizing the Japanese agriculture sector, big issue for Canada. We don't seem to be able to move with Japan because of the inability of Japan to deal with the need to reform its agricultural sector for its own sake, let alone the sake of others. Fixing Japan's fiscal problems. A lot has been done in terms of tremendous programs, in terms of progress in terms of the banks and so forth, but the fiscal problems are very, very significant. 160% of GDP, gross, 80% net. If Japan didn't own its own debt, it would be on its knees in front of the IMF. But that has to be solved, and there's a growing sense of lack of flexibility. We can't do this or we can't do that in the context of the need of a shrinking government because we are tied down with what we actually have. Improving Japan's relations with key Asian partners, China and Korea, which obviously became markedly cooler during his term. We'll come back to this, so this is just sort of laying out what Koizumi has left for Mr. Abe. Here we have Mr. Koizumi 2 days ago, waving goodbye as he left the Kante, 3 o'clock in the morning. He left the Prime Minister's office, and I think he was quite glad to do that. Koizumi, as you see, smiling and happy as he leaves to pursue his interests. He will continue as a parliamentarian with enormous influence, but to pursue his interests in music and in many other forms. He goes back to being a normal parliamentarian who will live in a large block of flats, which like other parliamentarians. Let's talk a bit about Shinzo Abe. Who is Shinzo Abe? An enigma to many Japanese, despite the fact that he's he's been on television a lot and for some time now. He's 52 years old. He just had his birthday 2 days ago, and he's married, no children. He's from Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is in the western part of Honshu. He graduated from Seikai University in Tokyo. In fact, he went right up in the Seikai system. There's from elementary right up to the university. There are several universities like this in Japan. And he studied for a while at USC. He didn't graduate from USC, but he University of Southern California. He grew up really as a political, the child of a politician. So while Yamaguchi is home, Tokyo is where he grew up. To be fair, he worked for 3 years for Kobe Steel and has very strong relationships with with certain parts of the Japanese industrial hierarchy, and will be Japan's youngest prime minister. The average age of prime minister since the Second World War is 63.6, and he is obviously only 52, so quite different. And this is both good and bad from different perspectives. The first post-war born prime minister. So. The worm is turning, the view is changing in Japan, and you have your first post-war born prime minister. His father was Shintaro Abe, and he died in 1991 while contending for it to be prime minister. He was the foreign minister for a while and very respected. Mr. Abe was his father's assistant before entering politics himself. His grandfather was Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi. He was Prime Minister for a short while in 1957. Prime Minister Kishi actually was at one point cited as a Class A war criminal, although he was never prosecuted under those terms. Mr. Abe himself is known as of a class which is quite distinct in Japan, of so-called hereditary politicians, whose fathers and in this case grandfathers were politicians and can almost sort of move in and move up because of his status as a prince in that sense. Mr. Abe wants to build a beautiful Japan, and one that, and in his words, cherishes culture, tradition, and history, while increasing Japan's contribution to the international community and continuing Japan's growth, innovation, and prosperity. Lots of little bits and pieces in there. That is actually one quote, and it's each part I'll come back to in some form. His political profile. First of all, he was handpicked by Koizumi in the latter's term as a prospective successor, despite his relatively young age. He's been given a series of high-profile LDP and cabinet positions. He won nationwide recognition in 2002, playing a prominent role in dealing with the North Korean abduction issues, which you'll be aware of, and as Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. So Koizumi makes a bold move, goes to North Korea, meets with his North Korean counterpart, but it's Shinzo Abe who gets the focus because he's tough, he's dealing with it, and it does result in significant movement on the part of the North Koreans. Some are released, and there's at least some attempt at transparency, which is very much an ongoing issue in Japan. Then he became Secretary General of the LDP. Liberal Democratic Party, and most recently as Chief Cabinet Secretary. As Chief Cabinet Secretary, he was on television every night. It's the Chief Cabinet Secretary who explains what the Japanese government is doing on a daily basis. This is important because Koizumi-san has a completely different style. He gives one line, sometimes half a line answers to things. So a long, complicated question will receive a response of 2 or 3 words in many cases. So it's Shinzo Abe who has, for the last few years, been the person explaining where Japan is going, much more than, on a day-to-day basis, much more than Koizumi himself. And finally, this is a person who's known as a hawk. But there's an interesting part to this. I know that there's a lot of focus in the press about Mr. Abe at this point in time in terms of his conservative leanings, and that's certainly, there's no question of that. But on the other hand, he has no need to prove those credentials. And that may be a real opportunity for Abe, Abe-san, which time will tell. Domestic politics. First of all, he's written about his views, and he's put it in a political manifesto entitled Towards a Beautiful Country. We keep coming back to the beautiful country. It's criticized as vague and in the press. Actually, hard to disagree. But he has been struggling to fill in the gaps as he goes along, as it suits him, because it doesn't actually suit him to be extremely precise in all cases. I'll mention that a little later. Despite resigning from the Mori faction prior to the LDP race, Mr. Abe may need to consider LDP factions more than Koizumi, and this is an important point. We've talked about the change in Japanese politics that Koizumi-san brought in. He basically broke the effect of the traditional factions within the Liberal Democratic Party. He did this by choosing his own cabinet, certainly in the second cabinet that he had, and he did it by simply ignoring what the traditional LDP factions told him to do. Mr. Abe does not have the popularity. He's telegenic, but he doesn't have the underlying populist approach. It's just not his style, and he may have to deal a lot more with the factions, and that will everyone is looking to see. Today's papers in Japan are full of this issue. If you look at any of the papers, they're all talking about that. What's the cabinet going to be, and what's the reflection? Are the tribes dead, or does this come back with Mr. Abe after an aberration? I don't think so, but we'll see shortly. And as I said, the first test will be filling important cabinet and other posts, an LDP post in this case. He will try to revise Japan's national and the nation's post-war constitution under the slogan of "New Departure from the Post-War Regime." I'll come back to that, but this is fundamental to his election platform. He has a new campaign he had a campaign buzzword which everyone is trying to figure out exactly what this means. It's called "re-challenging society." I suspect it makes a bit more sense in Japanese than in English, but it means it's about recognizing the change which is happening in Japan, the societal change, trying to make sure that there is, in a time when we have in Japan more so-called freeters and NEETs, people who are basically not even seeking to work, valorizing the workforce and providing, while at the same time providing opportunities for the underprivileged. Important because one of Koizumi's legacies is perceived to be a growing social gap between rich and poor. He wants to build up the kantei. The kantei is the Prime Minister's residence, but of course it actually means the Prime Minister's office. And he's inspired by the U.S. National Security Council. Now, in fact, there's been a lot of this in the press. It doesn't mean that he wants to build a huge bureaucracy. I mean, the U.S. NSC is absolutely enormous. But he wants to build up a separate advice capacity for independent advice. And I must say, I know that my colleagues in the foreign ministry are very concerned about this, very suspicious. But of course, he comes from the position of the chief cabinet secretary, and there that would be under the chief cabinet secretary, and that's where he thinks that you need much more independent analysis and intelligence, which Japan is notably lacking in. Intelligence, that is. So he's already recruiting bureaucrats to join the new kantei. The word is out on the street in Kasumigaseki, in the government quarter, and I'm going to be fascinated to see who ends up there. But this is a change. This is a significant change in Japanese politics. Having a separate analysis group that places Japan in its context is going to be very close to the Prime Minister. Will be a different way of doing things, and we'll have to see what that actually means. He also intends to beef up the Council on Economic and Fiscal Policy. This has been key to Koizumi in making his changes in the economic field. He's had some remarkable people, four of whom have stepped down, including Heizo Takenaka, who was his minister of reform for some time. But the choice of the four there is absolutely key. This is literally, we're down to watching names, who goes in, and therefore what will be the policies that he will follow. So this is crucial as well, perhaps more important than the choice of the NSC people, whatever you want to call it, the kantei people. His views, economic on the domestic side, and there's no question he's going to continue Koizumi's reforms. He intends to, in any case. And he's made clear statements to this effect. During his the run-up in the LDP elections, the minister Tanigaki, who was the finance minister, ran circles around him in terms of putting forward an economic platform. But in fact, he has not been very, very clear about what he wants on the economic side. I'll go through this, but there's a reason for it, for some of it. His top stated priority is to improve Japan's educational system through basic skills and public education. And there will be a revision of the basic education law early in the Diet session. It will be key to see how he moves this through. Comprehensive tax reform is required in the mid to long term. Everyone understands it. Big issue during the LDP elections, which are now over. But he's seeking to put off the issue until after the upper house elections. And indeed, again, we come back to the upper house. Upper house elections in 2007 will determine whether or not he has a real mandate. Remember that he was just elected by his own party on the basis of a huge majority, and he's seeking. It is clear that he is seeking to put this off. In fact, he's even said that he wants to put off this issue. It's a hot button issue, and he doesn't want to discuss it before the upper house elections. I'm not sure he'll be successful, but that's the idea. Greater priority spending cuts, no question. He wants a smaller government. He wants to reduce the deficit, and maybe we'll be looking a bit to Canada in the sense of where he gets his expertise in that regard. Economic strategies that benefit from Asian growth, clearly looking at Asia from an economic perspective. As I mentioned, he wants smaller, more efficient government. Polling definitely indicates that the majority want pension and social security system and reform, and there is frustration with Koizumi not dealing with it. So there's pent-up concern, and the rapidly aging Japanese population wants this dealt with quickly, and have really relatively little faith, if any, in the current system. Increased decentralization of regions, big issue in Japan. Very, very centralized country by anybody's standards, and there is a sense about what needs to be done. They need to decentralize, but how this is done, and is there the capacity, and what does this mean for fiscal transfers? They haven't figured it out yet, but clearly he says this is going to be a focus. He wants to transform agriculture and forestry and fishery sectors into strategic issues. Now, this is an interesting way of dealing with the issue. Of course, we know this is fundamental to Japanese policy at this point in time. And this is taking a bit of a page out of Koizumi's book, where Koizumi has said on various occasions, we can turn our agricultural policy problems into an opportunity, particularly in terms of maybe even into export, where, for example, Japanese strawberries do very, very well in Asia, selling it in outrageous prices. But they sell well, and specific types of things may be possible. So we'll see what he means by that. There's not much in terms of his economic views, in terms of the international side, but have no doubt that he will continue Koizumi's policy of promoting first the WTO. The Japanese don't like the fact that they're being pushed to move beyond the WTO, but for that reason and China's movement in Asia, they are focusing on FTAs quickly. And so he'll be aggressively promoting Asia-Pacific community, certainly to start with. I'll come back to that also. Foreign policy. I think this is really a bit of an asset and a liability for Abe-san. Here he is with the American ambassador. The American ambassador, Ambassador Schieffer, who co-owned the Texas Rangers with President Bush, is a key person in the general political landscape in Japan. This picture was taken right a few hours after the North Koreans launched missiles recently. Ambassador Schieffer was in the Kante in the Prime Minister's office, working with his Japanese colleagues in the middle of the night when they knew that these were going to be shot off. So as soon as the intelligence indicated, so there was a very, very strong relationship there, which is why I just put this up. He and Mr. Abe in particular worked very, very closely. So there's an interesting reflection there. Mr. Abe is calling for a strong and reliable Japan. He's speaking about Japan and speaking up about Japan's national interest in diplomacy. It'd be interesting to see what that actually means. Certainly, U.S.-Japan relations will remain the cornerstone. I mean, there's just no question there. Abe wants close relation between the PM's office and the White House. So again, we come back to this idea about having a stronger Kante, the Prime Minister's office. And he has assured the USA that Japan will further strengthen its role on the war on terror. That's the American term, of course, but that will be, he will show proof of that. I think in one of the first bills that will go through will be extension of the current law on Japan's support for the attack on terrorism. Now, he wants a strategic dialogue with countries that share common values. This, to date, includes reference to the United States, the European Union, Australia, and India. You notice Canada isn't up there. And we'll see what we can do about changing that. But that's where we are right now. We're not up there. So I've got my work cut out for me. But it's an important part of strategic dialogue with countries that share common values. I think Koizumi probably wouldn't have said that. I think it's probably more indicative of Abe's thinking than a sort of continuation from Koizumi. Wants to build a more trusting relationship with China and South Korea. He's been very vague about the possibility of his position on visiting Yasukuni Shrine. Can you blame him? But as you will know, he paid a private visit to Yasukuni Shrine earlier in the year, but has been very, very careful to steer away from that. Efforts are already underway to repair relations and engage with China and Korea. And my prediction, and this and 350 yen will get you a latte at Starbucks at Tully's in Tokyo. I predict that Mr. Abe will be in China will meet with the Chinese, the heads of the Chinese government within 2 weeks after his investiture on the 26th. Here we are talking about working with Asia. That picture up there is Foreign Minister Ban of Korea, of course, a prominent candidate to replace Kofi Annan. He's a big issue, exercising the right of collective self-defense. This has been a very big part of Abe's thinking from a very early stage. He's talking about setting sail anew from the post-war regime. What he appears to be doing, it's a little unclear, but he proposes right now drafting a new constitution that matches 21st century Japan. Specifically, what he's proposing to do is to enact a national referendum law to set the parameters for amendment of the Constitution. So he's starting to set up a process. Now, of course, at any point that could be turned back, and it could be turned back for a lot of different reasons, including, if things don't go well in the upper house, he could be out of there in a year. So we'll see what happens if he has to take the fall for a disaster in the LDP in those elections. He wants to test cases to redefine the applicable scope of collective self-defense. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, let me give you an example. And there's some say that this is apocryphal, and some say that it's true. But when the Japanese first peacekeeping deployment was in Cambodia, and there is a story that a Japanese soldier guarding a bridge near a UN voting establishment came under fire from unknown assailants, and never returned fire because he couldn't get a hold of anybody in Tokyo to determine whether or not he could return. But this may or may not be true, but it's absolutely right in terms of how Japan approaches its approach to peacekeeping. There is no common policy about how to do this. Every time the Japanese want to work in peacekeeping, they have to revisit the law and decide how does this apply in this particular case. In Samoa, for example, if they had come under attack, for example, if they'd come under attack when they were being guarded by the Australians or the Dutch, the rules of engagement say that they could have returned fire to protect themselves, but if the Australians had been in trouble, they could not have defended the Australians. Something needs to be done if Japan wants to do this, and this is the sort of thing which he's talking about in terms of what this actually means. What in terms of case what does this actually mean if Japan wants to step out onto the global stage? He will continue Koizumi's goal of working towards UN Security Council reform, have no doubt about that. Permanent membership for Japan will continue, and that will mean that it's an issue which Canada will have to continue to deal with. And he is calling for strategic ODA plans, humanitarian reconstruction assistance, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, environment, human rights, tentative diplomacy, all of which, of course, are Canadian specialties. His economic challenges. First of all, the Asahi Shimbun, I think, said the other day that economic management will be Abe's most difficult challenge. I think this is absolutely right. He's perceived to be quite weak on economics. Inexperienced, certainly from a political perspective, but weak on economics, and certainly the run-up to the LDP, the run-up of the LDP elections indicates that he just doesn't have the ability to be able to respond to tight questioning, and as a result, chose to stay away from it. But here's what we do know. He intends to further fiscal consolidation of approximately 5% of GDP to reduce Japan's public debt. That's set under Koizumi, so that's clearly underway. He understands that tax increases are required to reduce public debt and service the social security system. Where he's going to go with that remains a little unclear. As I said, probably will wait until after the 2007 Upper House elections. Full implementation of the postal system reforms, avoid backsliding. That's going to be a big challenge for him. The forces that want to avoid the postal system reform, which don't go forward until 10 years from now, will now be trying to push back, and this will be a challenge for him. Certainly business has come out, big business and small business, even the small businesses have come out very strongly in favor of continuing to push on these reforms, particularly on the postal system. Agricultural policy reform, something which Canadians were watching very carefully. Trade liberalization, smarter regulation, and then internationally, his challenges are going to be along the lines of potential global slowdown, U.S. or China, global imbalances, oil prices. Japan is not as isolated as they had thought in terms of oil prices and the impact on the economy. His political challenges, and I'm coming towards the end here. He's seen to be relatively politically inexperienced. This has its advantages too. He's not one of he's one of the old tradition, but not one of the old people. The perception is that he's weak on economic issues. I've mentioned that, and again, the choice of ministers and non-governmental advisors will be key in the very near future, by the 26th. He's camped out in his villa in Yamaguchi right now, just deciding what to do. His hardline positions on the North Korea are good domestic politics, but it's one thing when you're cabinet secretary or deputy cabinet secretary. It's another when you're the prime minister, and you have to actually reach across to a very enigmatic counterpart, if you want to put it that way, in the case of North Korea. He wishes to strengthen Japan's relations with China and South Korea, yet he's known as a hawk and a conservative. At the same time, he's proposing to amend the Constitution, which will alarm China and Korea and perhaps others. He's talking about turning the defense agency into a full ministry. That was supposed to go through under Koizumi, but it failed due to some parliamentary shenanigans. But anyway, he wants to do one thing and he wants to do another, but the two are not necessarily compatible. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this works. Despite popularity, he will not be able to replicate Koizumi's populism. He just doesn't have the political flexibility. And this is going to mean a different type of prime minister. And for somebody who's inexperienced, who's got some very good advisors around him, but he was relatively inexperienced, it's going to be a real challenge. Very different from Koizumi, who just sort of jumped in and then ignored everybody and just went over everybody's head when he needed to. He needs to be perceived as a builder and a reformer. This is very important. The Koizumi years were years of trying to get out of where Japan was over the last decade of 14 years of very poor growth. And he is having to, but one of the perceived and to a certain extent correct effects of this Japan pulling itself back up is a difference in the social a split in the social structure where richer and poorer, and more important, and also geographic divisions. Very rich, big cities, and if you go into the backwoods, back into the countryside, you see a real Rust Belt, and that's still there. That'll be a real catch. It's not big in terms of population, but it's big in terms of voting patterns and how things work. So it'll be very interesting to see how that works. Opposition parties, notably the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, sense the opportunity in the face of the new PM. There's a year to go to 2007, less than a year to the upper house elections, and they're already going to spring a trap in terms of wartime history. The new head of the DPJ, Ozawa-san, has been into Iwo Jima, a scene of terrible carnage, and seen to be a tremendous tragedy in Japan. And he has called Mr. Abe out for a debate on this, and it'll be interesting to see how Mr. Abe deals with this, because I think Ozawa is going to try it in the first days, as soon as he can, try to undermine him by bringing him out on this issue. What's the process? Right now, of course, you're aware that Mr. Abe has been elected as LDP president. He becomes, on 26th of September, an extraordinary session of the Diet will name him as LDP president, prime minister, and then he'll announce his cabinet. There'll then be a few days where they wait and prepare, and then on September the 29th, the main policies will be announced in the Diet. The Diet session in October is important. There'll be a few key pieces of legislation which they'll try, and if he doesn't get them through, there'll be a sense of, people will sense blood, they'll smell the blood, and they'll be after him right away. So this is key: baptism by fire, education, extension of terrorism law, and actually passing the budget. And that will the Japanese budget goes through around this time of year. It starts going through now. So 2007, very, very important test. In the upper house elections that I've been making, the positioning starts immediately, as I've mentioned, and this lopsided win for Mr. Abe in recent LDP elections is, really, I mean, he got 66%. Yeah, sure. I mean, he fell short of 70%, but it's overwhelming. It wasn't really much of a test. Upper house elections will be the real test, and it'll be a hard fall if he doesn't proceed. What are the implications for Canada? First of all, as I mentioned, we're not front and center for Abe-san. It's clear. Canada, hard to admit, but it's probably true. However, our status as a country which shares common values with Japan will keep Canada prominent. We are definitely a part of that group. We just aren't named, so we need to get a little bit more front and center in terms of the way he looks at things. And I can tell you that our ambassador in Japan, Mr. Joseph Caron, who is a real Japan hand, and he's there for his 4th time, he will certainly be trying to make sure that Mr. Abe looks at us, and no doubt our government as well. Platform of domestic reform to promote innovation, business, and investment should play to Canada's interest. He will be putting forward a series of bills to put this in place, including a new science and technology, so-called innovation strategy, which has $60 billion in it. So we want a piece of that. Economically strong and stable Japan is critical to the global economy, obviously. It's the world's 2nd largest economy, 3 times the size of China, et cetera, et cetera. Peace and security, interested in increased Japanese involvement on the global scene that could complement Canada's efforts. And here I think we're certainly, this is a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis in our political group in Tokyo. Continued focus on FTAs and extended partnership agreements. This is both a risk and opportunity for us because Canada is interested in trying to proceed, very interested in trying to proceed towards an FTA with Japan, but others will come first, and we're going to have to deal actively with Japan in that sense. Finally, he is likely to support, very likely to support the continuing strengthening of their cornerstones of our Canada-Japan relationship, which are the Canada-Japan Peace and Security Agenda. There's an entire agenda which was signed by Mr. Martin and Mr. Koizumi, but certainly has already been dealt with between Mr. Koizumi and Mr. Harbour, and likewise for the Canada-Japan Economic Framework. So these are really where our agenda with Japan are, and there's no question that will continue. The question is, really where. A few concluding thoughts. Again, another lovely screen by Sugimoto Sensei. What my ambassador calls a language and a license for reform. This is really what's happened under Koizumi, is giving a new language to reform and a license to do it. Koizumi really spurred action by the government and enabled tough decisions in the private sector for building a political consensus, more accepting of painful government and private sector restructuring. I mean, this is really quite fundamental. And it, sort of different to what I was saying before in some ways. He and his personally appointed team have defined a framework for the government action, and that went beyond rhetoric, that redefined what was acceptable in Japanese society. I don't think there's any going back. I think that if you do turn back the clock, if you try to turn back the clock, you will pay for it at the election, at the polling booth. Many Japanese probably believe that only Koizumi could have changed Japan the way he did, and I think personally, I think that's correct. Unlike traditional Japanese politicians, he's articulated a clear vision for the country and spoken directly to the Japanese people. This is unusual. I mean, this is just nothing like that has ever happened in Japan. During the election last year, I happened across a Koizumi speaking from the top of a truck, and I mean, it was like a rock star was there. There was just nothing like it. Everyone had their keitai, their cell phones out, and they were taking pictures and so forth. It was just, it's just not like a political rally anywhere else. I mean, the majority were women, but that isn't just women who voted for him by any means. So he identified issues, expressed them clearly, and did what he said he was going to do. Very, very different, radical. Where we stand now, with Koizumi, a more confident Japan. Certainly, Japan is a more confident nation with a political system based on issues, less on corporatist factional competition, an economy which is more resilient than any time since the bubble era, and more market-oriented, more competitive, more sustainable than the once feared bubble economy. Did we ever get that wrong? A more assertive foreign policy underpinned by a U.S. alliance, which again is stronger than ever. I mean, this is just essential to looking at the way Japan is moving forward on the basis of strength of its alliance with the U.S. And finally, a more open debate about Japan's history and its place in the world, foreign policy and defense terms. There's a lot more discussion about where Japan should go, and there are going to be many, many different ways of approaching that. Finally, for Mr. Abe. As one famous Japanese commentator has mentioned, getting elected was the easy part, now the hard part begins. Abe-san and others with him, who take the reins of power, are going to have to first improve Japan's political process and its responsiveness to voter concerns. They can't let there be backsliding or they'll pay for it. Pursue reforms in agriculture and address Japan's falling aging population. This is a country which is turning into quite a different. There's massive social transformation taking place in Japan over time, and he needs to start dealing with it now. Japan's public finances need to be put on a sustainable footing. Koizumi did not finish that. And address difficult relations with China and Korea. You've heard my prediction, and I bet you something I'm not a betting person, but I would suggest that something is going to happen quickly. Take further steps to deal with Japan's wartime record. If they want Japan to take on a political role on the global stage, they've got to deal with the problem. They've got to come up front with it, and they've got to deal with it. And Japan is Asia's leading democracy, and it needs to act in a way where it acknowledges and moves on in a way which brings others along with it. The Abe cabinet has less than a year to prove itself before the crucial upper house elections of summer 2007. So the clock is ticking as we speak. There's a lot to win and there's a lot to lose, and I think that's, as to say, now the hard part begins. And I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I've gone a little over my time, but perhaps we can combat personnel, but important significance. And a significance which goes beyond, I would suggest, the importance that Japan had for the so-called coalition of the willing. The fact is that every night on TV in Japan during that period, there was a report about our troops in Iraq. And if I can say what this really meant for Japan was deploy to Iraq but in deploying to Iraq, it forced Japanese to look at themselves in terms of where Japan stands in the world. What are we doing in Iraq? It's not a daily question. It wasn't a daily kind of question before in terms of where are we in the world. It forced Japanese to start looking at each other, and this is part of a wider phenomenon that is happening in Japan now. Much more activists in Asia. To a certain extent, there's a lot of catch-up with China, which is moving quickly through and cementing trade ties and other kinds of political ties. But it's more than just that. There's also Japan wanting to play its role, and Japan played a very important role in dealing with the immediate aftermath of the Banda Aceh tsunami. A little bit less in Sri Lanka, but in Banda Aceh in a very major way. Unfulfilled challenges. Well, no question that Koizumi did not succeed across the board, and there's much more to be done. First of all, he did not succeed in fully eliminating the vested interests. I think there's no question about that, and you just have to live in Japan to every night there seems to be some other scandal coming from some other place, highways or airports or whatever, where it appears that the old system seems to be alive and kicking. Modernizing the Japanese agriculture sector, big issue for Canada. We don't seem to be able to move with Japan because of the inability of Japan to deal with the need to reform its agricultural sector for its own sake, let alone the sake of others. Fixing Japan's fiscal problems. A lot has been done in terms of tremendous progress in terms of the banks and so forth, but the fiscal problems are very significant. 160% of GDP, gross, 80% net. If Japan didn't own its own debt, it would be on its knees in front of the IMF. But that has to be solved, and there's a growing sense of lack of flexibility. We can't do this or we can't do that in the context of the need of a shrinking government because we are tied down with what we actually have. Improving Japan's relations with key Asian partners, China and Korea, which obviously became markedly cooler during his term. We'll come back to this, so this is just sort of laying out what Koizumi has left for Mr. Abe. Here we have Mr. Koizumi 2 days ago, waving goodbye as he left the Kante, 3 o'clock in the morning. He left the Prime Minister's office, and I think he was quite glad to do that. Koizumi, as you see, smiling and happy as he leaves to pursue his interests. He will continue as a parliamentarian with enormous influence, but to pursue his interests in music and in many other forms. He goes back to being a normal parliamentarian who will live in a large block of flats, which like other parliamentarians. Let's talk a bit about Shinzo Abe. Who is Shinzo Abe? An enigma to many Japanese, despite the fact that he's also he's been on television a lot and for some time now. He's 52 years old. He just had his birthday 2 days ago, and he's married, no children. He's from Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is in the western part of Honshu. He graduated from Seikai University in Tokyo. In fact, he went right up in the Seikai system. There's from elementary right up to the university. There are several universities like this in Japan. And he studied for a while at USC. He didn't graduate from USC, but he at University of Southern California. He grew up really as a political, the child of a politician. So while Yamaguchi is home, Tokyo is where he grew up. To be fair, he worked for 3 years for Kobe Steel and has very strong relationships with certain parts of the Japanese industrial hierarchy, and will be Japan's youngest prime minister. The average age of prime ministers since the Second World War is 63.6, and he is obviously only 52, so quite different. And this is both good and bad from different perspectives. The first post-war born prime minister. So the worm is turning, the view is changing in Japan, and you have your first post-war born prime minister. His father was Shintaro Abe, and he died in 1991 while contending for it to be prime minister. He was a foreign minister for a while and very respected. Mr. Abe was his father's assistant before entering politics himself. His grandfather was Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi. He was Prime Minister for a short while in 1957. Prime Minister Kishi actually was at one point cited as a Class A war criminal, although he was never prosecuted under those terms. Mr. Abe himself is known as of a class which is quite distinct in Japan, of so-called hereditary politicians, whose fathers and in this case grandfathers were politicians and can almost sort of move in and move up because of his status as a prince in that sense. Mr. Abe wants to build a beautiful Japan, and one that, and in his words, cherishes culture, tradition, and history, while increasing Japan's contribution to the international community and continuing Japan's growth, innovation, and prosperity. Lots of little bits and pieces in there. That is actually one quote, and it's each part I'll come back to in some form. His political profile. First of all, he was handpicked by Koizumi in the latter's term as a prospective successor, despite his relatively young age. He's been given a series of high-profile LDP and cabinet positions. He won nationwide recognition in 2002, playing a prominent role in dealing with the North Korean abduction issues, which you'll be aware of, and as Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. So Koizumi makes a bold move, goes to North Korea, meets with his North Korean counterpart, but it's Shinzo Abe who gets the focus because he's tough, he's dealing with it, and it does result in significant movement on the part of the North Koreans. Some are released, and there's at least some attempt at transparency, which is very much an ongoing issue in Japan. Then he became Secretary General of the LDP. Liberal Democratic Party, and most recently as Chief Cabinet Secretary. As Chief Cabinet Secretary, he was on television every night. It's the Chief Cabinet Secretary who explains what the Japanese government...
What's your theory about it? Is it true that it's Koizumi's responsibility or his policy?
Well, I think it's a little hard to pin it all on Koizumi. I think a lot has happened during Koizumi, but a lot happened before. Let's look, first of all, at what Japan was not an egalitarian place before the Second World War. I mean, it just wasn't. It became a country after the Second World War where equity was very much a part of, social equity was a very part of distinguishing itself, not just in terms of itself, but in terms of other countries. It was a way of separating itself, for example, from the American occupation. But to rise up and to become a country where all Japanese could move up together, where Japanese the post-war generation sacrificed tremendously for the sake of the country. Poor people and a strong country, and that brought up the distinct nature of Japanese society, where enormous amounts of funds were put together by this iron triangle, invested in the economy in a way which promoted equal access to infrastructure and be it schools, roads, whatever, and health system and education, but it was built on a system which itself was flawed. So a system which was not sustainable, a system which led to corruption and to real estate bubbles and many other things. So I think to start with, blaming Koizumi for that system ending is not correct. I think what is happening, what has started to happen under Koizumi is, for the first time, positive things could be done, and there is a sense that there was not a reinvestment in that social equity. And that's where things started to happen. Slashing infrastructure. Slashing infrastructure is a difficult thing in Japan. I mean, roads to nowhere and so forth. I mean, this is, we know this in Canada as well. But the problem is that back in the countryside, and even in the more built-up areas, of course, this is jobs. And if you start taking that away, you take away take away the ability to hold that equity, to hold people in place, and to say that you're just as equal, in Takayama or as you are in Tokyo. So I think that they had a non-sustainable process, a non-sustainable economic system, and under Koizumi, as they started to change that, there was a tendency to look at that, and I think that is Japan's biggest question now. How is it in a country which is changing so fundamentally? Population is crashing, and the only country in absolute decline at this point in time. In a country where the population is graying very, very quickly and wants to make sure that it's properly taken care of, with a cohort behind it which simply does not have the funds. It doesn't even have the people. And not even in the interest in some case. People don't, large proportion of young people not even seeking work at this point in time. How does this all fit together? And I think it all comes back to a debate which needs to happen in Japan now about what the new project is. What is our projet de société, as we would say in Canada? What is our society-wide project? And I don't think they've figured that out yet. They're just getting out of where they were, which is a pretty bad place. They've had a couple of false starts. So there were 2 false starts to the to low growth, and people are pretty gun shy. But the debate has not really started yet on this. But I think it's unfair to pin it on Koizumi. But this is really going to start to be more of Mr. Abe's challenge more than Mr. Koizumi's, I think, in terms of what really happens now as opposed to helping the immediate transition. It's a very good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Politics, forgive me. Thanks, Mr. Drake. Politics of oil supply. Situation, I understand, is China is sourcing increasingly in Africa from what I'm reading. I don't know a lot, possibly even India in the background there somewhere. What about the oil supply behind everything? Japanese, this small delegation group in Iraq. How do you feel? I often see it as a proxy war here, with the Japanese kind of very silently, professionally, and brilliantly standing behind the United States in Iraq and with this oil thing. What is the perception of the oil supply politics in Japan today? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not sure that everything is at the point where we can understand it, but first of all, let's make it clear that there is a clear sense in Japan that they have a problem in dealing with the global oil supply as a whole. Of course, I mean, it's critical to the Japanese economy, but also that they have a real competitor in China, which used to be self-sufficient in oil, and in a very short time has gone to be the world's second largest and soon the world's first largest consumer of petroleum. And with the command and control economy that the Chinese have, they can intervene in the markets the way Japan cannot. Japan is a democracy and it's a market force, and they cannot intervene. And so they're very concerned about this. They are dealing with it, though, and it's interesting to see very quietly, under the radar, the Japanese are very concerned that the Chinese do not have proper buffer stocks in case of an oil shock of some sort. Well, it's Japanese companies who are working quietly with the Chinese to build Chinese buffer stocks, not because it's good for the Chinese, because it's good for Japan. So there's increasing thought about where this goes. But I think whereas the Chinese are starting to look at places such as Sudan and other places in Africa, that the Japanese are involved in other places. The Japanese are about to begin new FTA negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council. First time as a council, actually. It used to be with individual states within the Gulf Cooperation Council, but now they're about to start that. That's announced. And they have a very important relationship with Iran in the Degadan oil fields. There's also a big question about what happens in Siberia, and I think that the real challenge between Japan and China for resources is not so much in Africa at this point in time. It's in Russia in terms of Siberian gas and Sakhalin production as well. So farther east, more and more Baikal, towards Baikal, and then Sakhalin. So there is a jockeying going on. I think there's no question. I mean, the Russians are very canny negotiators, and they will act in their own interest. But it leads to some interesting questions. And one interesting question, which I just put out there more as a question, is that the Japanese are a very significant player in Iran. And at a time when Iran is proving to be unpredictable, I think the Japanese have a special potential role in Iran. And I think their oil concerns meet a global concern in terms of trying to ensure stability and perhaps a role in the unfolding nuclear crisis with Iran. So it's a complicated web. I don't think we know where it is. I don't think the fight is so much taking place. I mean, the competition is taking place in Africa. My sense is it's more in other areas, but this is continuing. It's an unfolding story. Jonathan, please.
Why do you think Canada has the Japanese radar? Why is there lack of attention or lack of awareness of us?
Well, I'm not so sure that we've dropped off. To be fair, I think that the world has changed very, very rapidly, and I think that we've had trouble keeping up. Let's look at what happened over the last 15 years. We've actually done quite well with Japan, despite the fact that we haven't done as well as we could have. I mean, we still have $11 billion in trade alone going in each direction, and about as much in investment. I mean, it's a completely different picture in that regard. And investment, two-way investment equal, and that's quite remarkable. But as it comes down to both economics and the politics, I think we need to look at a Canada which, for a while, focused on North America. Where we did extremely well, where we have changed our economy. And there was a real ongoing project in Canada to adapt. And entire sectors have changed in Canada. Some for better, some for worse, but overall the country has really gained from that. I know there's an ongoing debate about that, and I won't get into it, but it was a focus on North America. At the same time, I think the Japanese started to look elsewhere as well, to the extent that they could really influence things at a time when they weren't the economic power, or not perceived to be the economic power that they once were. So I think it's more concours de circonstances. I think that the circumstances were such that we looked away from each other. And I'm not saying this to be polite. I think that things have changed. Japan is coming back economically, and it is coming back politically as well. In fact, coming back is not right the word. It is redefining itself in terms of where it is on the world stage. And that is, I really look at it in terms of new opportunities. I think looking back, we risk misdiagnosing where we need to go if we look back. I think that Japan is changing so fundamentally, politically and economically, that if we keep looking back and we try to see where we failed, we won't get the right answer. I think what we need to do is to look at others and how they're dealing with Japan. Australia is a good example. The Australians have really have a very important relationship with Japan, but economically it's ultra important to Japan, much more important to Australia. It's more important to Australia than certainly their relationship, economic relations, than Japan is to us. We need to face the fact that Japan is our second largest economic partner. I know people say China, but it's largely one way. Japan is very, very balanced, and really. For Japan, we're number 14, maybe. And we need to think about where Japan is going, and we need to think about how we want to position our country. And I think we need to look at others. The Australians have been very, very good at dealing with Japan. But the real question is, what are we going to invest as a country in terms of dealing with Japan? And the Australians have quite a complete relationship with Japan, and ours is really, I would argue, in its infancy. But the opportunities are fantastic. Japan will remain the world's second largest economy for a long time, and it's a country which is going to start stepping out on the world stage. Whether or not they change the constitution, they'll start stepping out a lot more, and we need to deal with it, and we need to think about it. And here, I'll make one point which everyone in our embassy will tell you. It's not just about Japan. It's about Asia. And it's about who we are with regard to Asia. It's about who we are in North America and how we connect up. Japan is an essential part of what's happening in Asia, economically, politically. There's a great project underway, a multi-year project underway of Asian integration from a political perspective. It's going to take a little longer. Economic, it's almost already there to a certain extent. Talk about ASEAN plus ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6. There's real dialogue taking place here, and I think that we need to think about not just Japan, but in terms of what's happening in Asia and Japan's critical role in that process. I mean, in China, it may seem small in Chinese from a Chinese perspective, but Japanese firms employ 11 million Chinese. Southeast Asia, it's been huge for many, many years, an almost untold story. So Japan is reaching out to India. There's a change here, and there's a bit of a push and pull, but we need to look at this issue in terms of not just Japan, but how we look at Asia and what role we think Japan has in that, and what role we have in that process and the connection in North America. So I would just recast the question a little differently. Sorry,
Toward the end of your presentation, you mentioned that one of the major issues is going to be this extremely important and also very sensitive issue of dealing with the wartime role. So I wonder if you could give us any of your further thoughts on that. Are we looking at more apologies, compromise on Yasukuni, or addressing this, at least, perception of internal insincerity?
well, I think that this is almost an impossible discussion because, one risks being, apologist for Japan or apologist for others, and it's a difficult one, and one which is a really difficult discussion, but a very active discussion in Japan itself. First of all, I think that one needs to look at a new. There'll be a new perspective here. I think that there will be a sense of we need to deal with this. There are a whole different series of things which need to be addressed. One is the status of the Yasukuni Shrine itself. And there are all kinds of proposals, including sort of de-enshrining the Class A war criminals. Frankly, I don't think that's going to happen. I think my understanding of, I had a discussion with this recently with the head priest of the Toshogu Shrine. This is the shrine in Nikko. It's one of the high shrines. And the head priest, a wonderful person, said, it just isn't possible to de-enshrine. It's just not part of the religion. So there are talks about having essentially having another place in which respects can be paid. It's really but it's fundamental to the Japanese soul. It doesn't actually. Yasukuni far predates the Second World War and the two wars with China. It goes back to a Japanese Civil War. So it's very fundamental in the Japanese soul, but it's tied up with other things. I think what is going to start happening is a more straightforward dialogue, less provocation, certainly. I think that there needs to be some give on the other side as well. Let's face it, the Korean leader has been, this is good politics for him these days. He's not strong at home. Being a populist and a little Japan bashing, despite the fact that things are really picking up with Japan culturally and not just others, is something which it takes two to tango here. In China, of course, there are questions about how the Chinese deal with this, and I think if you ask a Japanese, what do you think would happen if a Japanese prime minister said that he was not going to go to Yasukuni, promised? Well, I guess the reaction tends to be, well, the Chinese will just pull something else out. So there needs to be more dialogue. They need to get on a better plane, and I think that it's that the provocation, lack of dialogue, back and forth. It's just it's a self-fulfilling process, and they need to break that chain. And I think that Mr. Abe understands that that's probably the most important thing that he can do, and I think he'll act early on it. It's a very difficult discussion. I think there's a lot of goodwill. If you look at the polling, for example, in Japan, the polling is largely against. Depends how you ask the question, of course, but it's against the prime minister going to the shrine. And certainly in the last round when he went in August, it was extremely, I think, surprisingly negative. So there's a lot to be done, and I think that we're going to see a difference. But it does take two to tango, and we'll have to see what the response is as well. But I think the Japanese will make the first move. And that being said, of course, it's not the only issue. It always gets tied up with other issues. I mean, you've got the Chinese submarines coming into Japanese waters. You've got flashpoints along disputed areas with both Korea and China. So the problem is that everything gets mixed up altogether, and then the last word is Yasukuni and end of dialogue. You've got to break that cycle. Please.
If you know or could speculate, perhaps, as to how the change in leadership will affect the belated implementation of Japan's new company law, particularly in how it relates to foreign direct investment.
Sorry, what specifically do you want to know? Because it's a big topic.
Koizumi had a goal of doubling FDI until 2006,
Right.
and he renewed that goal. I'm not sure what the figure was, but the company law that he was trying to implement last year addressed that specifically regarding foreign direct investment, particularly stock swaps between foreign companies to make acquisitions of Japanese companies. And
Well, first of all, thank you for the clarification. First of all, Koizumi's doubling of ODA is what we would call in Canada lowballing. Japan is very, very low in terms of the foreign investment in OECD countries. So doubling ODA is a pretty small goal. They need to do a lot more than that. In order to get that, as you say, you have to change the economic, the underlying economic climate and the enabling environment. And the corporate law is one thing. Of course, they ran into all kinds of trouble here. As soon as they put forward the corporate law and the stock swaps and so forth, the foreign investment community went ballistic because it was not properly worked out. And here we come to an issue about Japan, which is changing. Japan is learning a new kind of economy, and in the process, one of the most remarkable things that you can look at is the new financial services agency, which is starting to move the Japanese economy. It's very important. They're being very tough. It's the threat of having the FSA on top of you, which has really kept the Japanese corporate establishment moving forward ahead of the government so they didn't get repossessed and so forth. And these guys are tough. They're a little inexperienced, and drawing up legislation with a political apparatus which is largely relatively elderly is difficult, because there was I think a pushback from people who were used to doing things a certain way in the Diet, and as a result you got less than ideal and certainly not world-class legislation coming forward. So I think I would put this more in terms of a learning process in Japan. They clearly understand that things need to be done. There's a will to do it, and I think that will continue under Mr. Abe. But there is, remember how far Japan has come in the last while, and it needs to relearn a lot of things. Mr. Abe, I know, very much wants to redefine Tokyo as a global financial capital, which it isn't anymore, unfortunately. You can see there's only one Canadian bank that's permanently really resident in Tokyo these days. I mean, others, there are derivatives of banks which are there. So I think that it comes back to a Japan which is changing, and a Japan which is learning as it goes, and that's really what we need to look at. And of course they're not going to get it right every single time, but there's an intent to, and that's what Mr. Abe's challenge is.
David, I think time for one last question, and then we'll have to end the formal part of this forum.
Yeah, you said earlier that Abe-san doesn't need to prove his sort of credentials. I mean, and you almost sort of insinuated that was sort of a positive thing. I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yes, I think that, well, here we get into some sort of personal perspective, but I'll give you my personal perspective. My sense is that Koizumi was a very sincere person, and he believed that he was doing the right thing by going to Yasukuni Shrine. And here, there may be a difference between Koizumi and Abe. John Curtis, very famous Japan ophile and Japan expert, said that there may be a difference between Koizumi and Abe in that Koizumi is very sentimental, and Abe is very much more of an ideologue. But Koizumi did not have a large backing when he came in. He almost got to be the head of the LDP by accident. I mean, at the time when he was elected, people thought that Hashimoto was going to get it for sure. So he kind of stumbled into this, and as a result, he didn't have all the credentials that he needed to sort of make things forward. Sure, populism works, but you need more to that as well underneath. And my sense is that he believed sincerely in what he was doing. I mean, it's up to you, everybody, to make their own judgment of whether that was good or not. But I think he was quite sincere about it. But I think that he also needed it to some extent. I don't think that to have the support and to keep the support. So I mean, he's very radical in many other ways, so let's keep at least that front under control. On the other hand, I think that Mr. Abe, he doesn't need to posture. He doesn't need a posture. He's known to be tough. I mean, he comes from a very conservative family. He has very tough credentials in dealing with the North Koreans. He has good conservative credentials in terms of economic policy. He's got very good credentials, for example, with regard to Social Security reform and pension reform. So he's going to need more help, Abe-san. Than Koizumi, because he can't sort of appeal atop of everybody else. He's going to have to work the system to make it work, not just bypass it or go on top. And so I think whereas Koizumi had to bring in, he had to help look for some support on the right wing. Abe's credentials are good there, and he needs to look for support elsewhere. So it's a different type of rapport. And I think that's really what I meant in terms of conservative, the advantage of having conservative credentials, at least, and that may help him in dealing with China. Doesn't have to apologize to anybody that he didn't go to Yasukuni. Everybody knows where he stands. Okay?
I'd now like to call on Dr. Jan Walls, the founder and director emeritus of the David Land Center, to thank our speaker, but also to announce that at the end of the thank you, the formal session will be over, but I think David's prepared to stay for a little while to chat with some of you one-on-one.
David gave us a very well-founded historical context with the issues that Abe is going to be inheriting, and you gave us a comprehensive overview of the sectors within which these issues fall, and you even gave us some very, very enticing insights into what his directions are likely to be, and in some cases not to be. And frankly, you've given me an uncomfortable feeling because I'm not accustomed to having the feeling that I actually understand what's going on. That is to be taken as a compliment to the comprehensive nature and the clarity of your presentation. The David Land Center would like to leave you with a little token of their appreciation. Now, please don't take this the wrong way. You have a fine mug. In fact, I wish I had inherited a mug like yours. The David Land Center also has a monogram mug, which I would like you to the next forum that has been scheduled here on Thursday, November the 2nd, called Wit and Humor in Chinese TV Commercials, be presented by an obscure but promising sinologist named Waltz.
Yeah, we got a lot of that.
Yeah.